I want you to picture a small conference room, beige walls, a long table. On one side, three people in suits I'd never met before that morning. On the other side, my sister, refusing to look at me. And in front of all of us, a single folder. Inside that folder was the proof of everything she had taken from me. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't slam the folder shut for dramatic effect. I just slid it across the table and said one sentence. This is mine. You can check the dates yourself. Nobody spoke for almost 10 seconds. 10 seconds doesn't sound like a long time until you're sitting inside it, watching someone's face change in real time as they realize they've been caught. That moment is where this story ends. But it's not where it starts. If you've ever been the kid in your family who tried hardest and got noticed least, the one who did everything right and still came second to a sibling who barely tried, stay with me. Because this isn't really a story about a stolen application or a stolen project or whatever you want to call what she did to me. It's about something almost every family does in ways big and small that nobody ever puts a name to. Psychologists actually have a name for it now. They call it parental differential treatment. And there's real research published just last year that found something most people in my position already knew in their bones. Parents really do play favorites, and they tend to lean toward the kid who's easier, more agreeable, less likely to push back. The kid who color codes within the lines. Not because that kid is more loved, because that kid is more convenient. And here's the part that took me years to understand. When you grow up watching someone else get chosen over and over, in small ways that never quite add up to a single moment you can point to, you don't usually become angry right away. You become useful. You learn to need less. You learn to ask for nothing, because asking never worked anyway. That's who I was at 15. That's who I still was at 25. Walking into a job I'd built entirely on my own in a field nobody in my family thought I was capable of. I didn't know yet that the version of me my family had quietly decided not to invest in was about to become the only version of me that mattered. I didn't know that 12 months later, I'd be sitting across a table from my own sister, watching her realize that everything she'd borrowed from my life, my work, my words, the one thing I'd built without anyone's help, was about to be the exact thing that ended hers. I didn't know any of that yet. All I knew on the ordinary Tuesday this story actually begins was that I was tired of being the daughter nobody bothered writing down. So let me start there. Not in the conference room. In the house where it all began, where the rules were never spoken out loud, but everyone in that family knew them anyway. I grew up in a house that looked, from the outside, like nothing was wrong. Nice street, nice cars in the driveway. The kind of family people assumed had it all figured out. My sister, Maddie, came along 3 years after me. And from almost the day she was born, something in the house shifted in a way I couldn't name yet, but I could feel. It wasn't that my parents loved her more. I don't actually believe that even now. It was something quieter and harder to fight. She was easier. She smiled at the right times. She didn't ask hard questions at dinner. She didn't push back when she was told no. And it turns out, that's not just a feeling I had, it's an actual pattern researchers have found. A major study published last year looking at almost 20,000 people across 30 separate research papers found that parents really do tend to favor the child who is more agreeable and easier to manage. Not because they love that child more, because that child requires less from them. I was not that child. I asked why. I pushed back. I wanted reasons, not just rules. And in a house that ran on quiet compliance, that made me the difficult one before I'd done anything to earn the label. I remember being 11, playing a piano piece I'd practiced for months without missing a note. I came off stage and my mother kissed my forehead and said, "That was nice, sweetheart." Then she turned to my aunt and said, "Maddie has such a natural stage presence, doesn't she?" Maddie hadn't touched a piano in over a year. I remember being 16 and telling my parents for the first time out loud what I wanted to do with my life. My father set down his fork. My mother gave me the kind of smile you give a kid who says she wants to be an astronaut. 2 weeks later, I heard my mother telling a friend that Maddie, 13 years old at the time, had always dreamed of doing exactly that. Word for word, the thing I had said at that dinner table. I want to be careful here because I know how this can sound. This wasn't a house with screaming matches or slammed doors. Nobody was cruel in an obvious way. That's actually the part that took me the longest to untangle, and it's the part the research gets right too. Being treated unfairly doesn't always look dramatic from the outside. What actually does the damage isn't just being treated differently, it's being treated differently without ever being given a real reason why. When kids can make sense of why something's unequal, she's younger, she needs more help right now, it doesn't sting the same way. When there's no reason, when it's just quietly understood and never spoken, that's when it starts to reshape how you see yourself. By the time I was in high school, I understood the unspoken org chart of my own family. Maddie was the one they were building a future around. I was the one who was expected to figure my own out, quietly, without making anyone uncomfortable. So I did. I applied to college on my own, wrote every essay without showing anyone, got in on my own merit with zero help from anyone at that dinner table. When I told my parents, my mother said, "Well, that's good for you," in the exact tone you'd use about a stranger's mildly nice vacation. My father told me not to expect help paying for anything beyond it, that money was already being set aside for Maddie's future, whatever it turned out to be. I worked 2 jobs through college. I built my own path, brick by brick, with nobody holding the ladder. And somewhere in that process, without anyone in my family noticing or asking, I became genuinely good at something. Something that was entirely unmistakably mine. I didn't know yet that mine was a word my family didn't fully respect. I didn't know that the thing I built alone, the thing nobody else in that house had touched or helped shape, was about to become the exact thing someone tried to take. I moved out the week I graduated. Not in a dramatic way, no slammed doors, no speech. I just packed my car and drove 4 hours to a city where nobody knew which daughter I was supposed to be. I took a job as a case manager at a small immigration legal aid nonprofit. It wasn't glamorous. The pay was modest enough that my mother, when I told her, asked if it was more of a volunteer thing or do they actually pay you for that? I didn't bother explaining that I'd be doing intake interviews, building case files, translating documents, and sitting with people through some of the hardest conversations of their lives. She wouldn't have asked a follow up question anyway. 3 weeks into the job, I was assigned to a family that had just arrived seeking asylum. The father had been a teacher back home. The mother worked nights cleaning office buildings. Their son, 16, was trying to finish high school in a language he was still learning while helping translate for his own parents at every appointment, every clinic visit, every confusing piece of mail. His name doesn't matter for this story. What matters is that I spent the next 2 years building his family's case from the ground up. Affidavits, country condition research, hundreds of hours documenting a story that the system kept asking them to prove over and over again, as if trauma needed a paper trail to be real. I wasn't required to do half of what I did. I stayed late writing briefs that weren't technically my job. I drove people to appointments on weekends. I learned slowly that the work I was good at wasn't the kind you can fake your way through. You either show up consistently for people or you don't. And everyone in that world can tell the difference immediately. Somewhere in that process, I started keeping a private file. Not a diary exactly, more like a working draft of everything I'd learned, written the way you write something you might someday need to explain to someone else. The reasoning behind certain arguments. The way I'd learned to frame a case so a judge could actually understand the stakes, not just the facts. I saved it to a shared family cloud drive because that's where I'd saved every important document since I was 17. An old habit from a house that, ironically, had taught me to document everything, just in case. I didn't think anything of it. I closed the file one evening after a long day and didn't open it again for almost 3 weeks. Meanwhile, Maddie was 3 years into the path everyone had quietly built for her. A path with a private tutor, a personal admissions consultant, and shadowing opportunities arranged through family connections rather than earned through actual work. My mother told her friends at dinner parties that Maddie had real hands on experience in exactly the field I'd spent 2 years actually working in. I happened to know because I'd checked the volunteer sign in sheets out of nothing more than idle curiosity, that Maddie's actual time on site amounted to a handful of afternoons. There's a phrase researchers use for what was happening in our family, and once I learned it, a lot of things clicked into place. I was the scapegoat. Maddie was the golden child. Not villains, either of us. Just two roles assigned early, reinforced for years that neither of us had really chosen. I didn't think about any of that yet, though. I was just doing my job, building something that was mine, in a life my family had mostly stopped paying attention to. I had no idea that somebody back home had started paying very close attention indeed. It started with a small thing, a coincidence I almost let slide. Maddie had been accepted into a competitive fellowship program, the kind that requires a personal statement, work samples, real demonstrated experience. I found out about it secondhand from an aunt, the way I found out about most things in that family. I didn't think much of it. I was happy for her, in the distant, slightly numb way you're happy for people who've never once been happy for you. Then a few months later, I was helping a colleague review some publicly available fellowship materials for a workshop we were running. Examples of strong personal statements, the kind that get shared as models for other applicants. My colleague pulled one up that had been making rounds online as an example of excellent writing. I read 3 sentences before my stomach dropped. It wasn't just similar to something I'd written, it was something I'd written. A specific framing I'd developed for explaining why country condition evidence matters in an asylum case. A phrase I'd worked on for almost 20 minutes one night, rewriting it 4 times until it finally said exactly what I meant. There it was, word for word, sitting inside Maddie's fellowship essay. I sat very still for a long moment. Then I went home and opened the shared family drive. I found my old working file, the one I'd saved almost 2 years earlier and forgotten about. I clicked on the version history, which is a feature I didn't even know I'd need until that exact moment. The document had been opened by my account dozens of times over the 2 years I'd worked on it. And then there was one entry that didn't belong to me at all, my mother's account. A single viewing session, late at night, roughly 5 weeks before Maddie's fellowship deadline. No edits, just a view. 5 weeks. That's all it had taken. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment because it wasn't rage, not at first. It was something colder and more specific. The particular sting of watching 2 years of unpaid overtime, weekend driving, middle of the night writing work get folded into someone else's life story as if it had simply appeared there. I called the colleague who'd shown me the essay and asked as casually as I could manage where exactly that sample had come from. She said it had been submitted as part of the fellowship's published cohort of outstanding voices, essays selected to be shared publicly as models of excellence, which meant it wasn't just sitting quietly in some file somewhere. It was being held up publicly as an example of my sister's voice. I sat with that for a few days before I did anything. I want to be clear about that because I think people expect a moment like this to trigger something immediate and explosive. It didn't. What it triggered was a long, quiet kind of math. I thought about every dinner table moment, every Maddie has always loved that, every time my own words had been quietly reassigned to someone else's life. And I realized this wasn't a one-time thing. This was just the first time I'd actually caught it on paper. I had two real options in front of me. I could let it go, the way I'd let go of almost everything for 20-some years because confrontation in my family had never once gone well for me. Or I could do something I'd never done before, build an actual case, the kind I built every day for other people, except this time the client would be me. I chose the second one. I didn't know yet how far that choice would take me, or what it would cost my sister, or what it would finally force my parents to admit out loud after years of never having to. All I knew, sitting at my kitchen table with a version history open on my laptop, was that I was done being the daughter whose work simply disappeared into someone else's name. So I started writing things down. Everything. Dates, timestamps, every single thing I could prove. If you've never built a case for a living, here's the first thing you learn. Feelings don't win arguments. Documents do. So I stopped thinking about how angry I was, and I started thinking like the case manager I'd spent 2 years becoming. I made a list. Not a list of grievances, a list of evidence. First, the version history on the shared drive. I took screenshots of every access date, every edit timestamp, every account that had ever touched that document. My mother's single late night viewing session, 5 weeks before the fellowship deadline, was right there in black and white, completely unaware it had ever been a problem. Second, I requested my own employment records from the nonprofit, hours logged, case files I'd built, written confirmation from my supervisor of the exact work I'd done and when. If anyone was going to question whether the language in that file actually belonged to me, I wanted a clean, boring, undeniable paper trail. Third, and this took the most courage, I called my supervisor, Renata, and told her what I'd found. Renata had been doing this work for over 20 years. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she said something I still think about. Some people borrow a single sentence by accident. Nobody accidentally borrows someone else's professional voice for an entire fellowship application. She offered to write a short statement confirming the work was mine, dated, signed, official. Fourth, I reached out to the fellowship program itself, carefully without accusing anyone yet. I simply asked what their policy was on authorship verification for the published Outstanding Voices essays. They sent back a standard policy document. Buried in Section 4, applicants certify, under penalty of disqualification, that all submitted materials represent their own original work and experience. That one sentence changed everything. This wasn't just an awkward family situation anymore. It was a violation with actual consequences attached to it, written down by people who had nothing to do with my family at all. I spent the next 2 weeks compiling everything into a single folder: chronological, sourced, boring in exactly the way good evidence is supposed to be boring. No accusations, no adjectives, just dates, names, and documents that spoke for themselves. During that time, my mother called twice. The first time, she asked if I'd heard about Maddie's exciting fellowship news, in a tone that made it clear she had no idea what I knew. I said congratulations and nothing else. The second call came after she somehow learned I'd been asking the fellowship program about their policies. Small towns and small families gossip the same way. Her voice had changed completely. "Why are you stirring up trouble over a fellowship?" she said. "It's not that big a deal. It's just an essay." I didn't argue with her on the phone. I'd learned over 20-some years that arguing with my mother in the moment never once changed anything. I just said, "I have to go," and hung up. That night, I sat with the full folder open on my laptop. Every screenshot, every statement, every policy document, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Not triumph, exactly. Something steadier than that. For the first time in my life, I wasn't asking my family to see me clearly. I had built something that didn't need their permission to be true. There was one more piece I needed, though, something that would settle, beyond any doubt, the exact moment my mother had decided my work belonged to someone else. And it turned out the answer to that had been sitting in our family's house the entire time, in a place I'd been taught my whole life never to look. Chapter 6: The Reckoning. I drove home on a Sunday, the same way I always did when I had no other choice. Quietly, with no warning, because warnings in my family only ever gave people time to prepare a better version of the truth. The house looked exactly the same. Same wreath on the door. Same quiet hum of a family that had perfected the art of looking fine from the outside. I walked straight up to the small office off my parents' bedroom, the room my mother used for her charity paperwork, the one room in the house she'd always treated as hers alone. I'd never gone through her things before, not once, not even as a kid, because the rule in our house had always been unspoken, but absolute. That room was private. I wasn't there to snoop, though. I was there for one specific thing: a printed copy of an early fellowship draft Maddie had once left at the house, the one I suspected still had my mother's handwritten notes in the margins, the same handwriting I'd seen on 100 birthday cards growing up. I found it in the second drawer of the desk, exactly where I guessed it might be. Notes in blue ink, suggestions on which experience to highlight. A circled sentence that read, almost verbatim, the line I'd written 2 years earlier in my own file. I took a photo. I put the paper back exactly where I found it. I went downstairs. My mother was in the kitchen. Maddie was at the table on her laptop. My father was reading something on his phone, the way he always managed to be present and absent at the same time. I didn't yell. I didn't need to. I set my laptop on the table, opened to the folder I'd built, the version history, Renata's statement, the fellowship's authorship policy, and the photo I'd just taken upstairs. I turned it so Maddie could see it. I'm not here to ruin your life, I said. I'm here because I'm done watching my work disappear into yours. Maddie's face went through three different expressions in about 4 seconds: confusion, recognition, and then something closer to fear. My mother reached for the laptop. I closed it before she could touch it. You don't understand how hard this has been for her, my mother said. She's under so much pressure. You have no idea. I know exactly what pressure looks like, I said. I've been building cases for people under real pressure for 2 years. This isn't that. My father finally looked up from his phone. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then quietly he said, Bridget, is this true? Not to me, to my mother. The silence that followed was longer than any silence I'd sat through in that house in my entire life. I told them what would happen next, plainly, the same way I'd explain a legal process to a client. The fellowship had an authorship review process. I had already submitted my documentation. There would be a formal inquiry. Maddie would have a chance to respond. I wasn't asking permission. I was informing them the way you inform someone about a decision that has already been made. 3 weeks later, the fellowship's review committee reached its decision. Maddie was removed from the cohort, her essay withdrawn from the Outstanding Voices collection, and the fellowship rescinded. The letter cited, in careful institutional language, a violation of the program's authorship certification. My mother called me the day the decision came through. She didn't apologize. She said, I hope you're happy. You've humiliated this entire family. I didn't argue. I'd stopped needing her to understand a long time before that phone call ever happened. My father called 2 days later. He didn't defend her. He just said, I should have asked more questions a long time ago. I'm sorry I didn't. It wasn't everything, but it was something. The first honest sentence anyone in that house had said to me in years. Chapter 7. The Quiet. After I drove back to my apartment that evening and didn't cry until I was already inside, sitting on my kitchen floor with my back against the cabinet, the way I used to sit on my bedroom floor as a teenager when I needed somewhere private to feel things nobody else in that house had room for. I want to be honest about something. It wasn't a triumphant cry. It wasn't relief exactly either. It was closer to grief, the specific kind that shows up not when something ends, but when you finally let yourself admit how long it had actually been happening. In the weeks that followed, I didn't hear from Maddie. I didn't expect to. I heard from my mother exactly once more, a short message that said only that she hoped I was satisfied. I read it, and I didn't reply, and I didn't feel the old pull to fix it or explain myself or make it smaller so she could feel better about it. That, more than anything else, is how I knew something had actually shifted in me. My father and I started talking again, slowly. Not about what happened, mostly about smaller things. A book he was reading. A trip he was thinking about taking. It wasn't a full repair. I don't think it ever will be. But it was real. In a way, very little between us had been before. I kept working. Renata made me lead on a case a few months later. The first time I'd been handed something that big without having to prove, yet again, that I could be trusted with it. I sat with a new family one evening, helping a mother explain to her son why a judge needed certain documents, translating not just language, but fear into something a 16-year-old could carry without it crushing him. I thought, somewhere in that conversation, about the file I'd written 2 years earlier, the one that had started all of this. I thought about how strange it was that the thing my family had tried to take from me had simply become more of itself instead of less. There's a small habit I picked up afterward, something my colleague Renata does for every case she finishes. She keeps a single object on her desk from each one, something small that reminds her the people in the files were real, not just paperwork. I started doing the same thing. On my desk now is a worn folder tab from that very first case, the family I'd worked with for 2 years, the one whose words I'd accidentally handed my sister without knowing it. It's not a dramatic object. Nobody else would look twice at it. But I know exactly what it cost to build and exactly what it survived. I think about the research now and then, the studies on favoritism. on the roles families assign their kids before either kid ever gets a say. None of it excuses what happened, but it did something almost as useful. It helped me stop asking why me, as if I'd done something to deserve being the overlooked one, and start understanding that the roles were never about merit in the first place. They were just roles. I happened to get cast in one that, it turns out, taught me how to build a case, how to document things carefully, how to wait quietly until the truth had enough evidence behind it to finally be undeniable. My sister lost a fellowship. I didn't do that to her, not really. She did that the moment she let someone hand her my words and call them hers. What I did was simply refuse to disappear quietly the way I always had before. I'm not telling you this story so you'll feel sorry for me. I'm telling you because if you've ever been the one in your family who tried hardest and got noticed least, I want you to hear this clearly. Your work is still yours, even when no one around you bothers to say so. Eventually, if you keep building it carefully enough, it gets harder and harder for anyone to quietly take it from you. That's the whole story. Not revenge, just the truth, finally allowed to speak for itself.